You're a welfare queen. The words cracked through Congress like a rifle shot, slamming into Jasmine Crockett before 12 million Americans watching live. Gasps ricocheted off marble walls. Veterans' knuckles whitened, and tension coiled tighter with every heartbeat. Trey, what could drive a war hero to march forward and hang his Purple Heart around her neck? Dawn broke over Washington, D.C., painting the Capitol dome gold. Inside, the chamber was already tense. This was no routine bill. Today's hearing could decide whether millions kept their Social Security and Medicare. Jasmine Crockett sat calm but alert, scanning the room like a general before battle. She knew these votes meant life or death choices for seniors and veterans. Then Nancy Mace entered. Heels sharp on marble, eyes sliding past opponents. Every step was a challenge. She wasn't here to debate. She was here to win. Across the country, people leaned toward their screens, not knowing the hour ahead would explode in a moment replayed for decades. Outside the chamber, America was already watching. In a small kitchen in Ohio, an elderly couple sat close to the TV, mugs of coffee cooling in their hands. In a veterans' hall in Texas, rows of men in faded service caps leaned forward, eyes fixed on the screen. In Florida, a group of retirees huddled in a condo rec room, the closed captions scrolling under every word. In the back row of the chamber, Frank Miller sat silently. Vietnam veteran, Purple Heart, 72 years old. His posture was stiff, his weathered cane propped against the bench. In his lap, a single letter. The paper worn soft, edges curling, gripped tightly in his hand as though it might slip away if he let go. On TV screens across the nation, a bold headline scrolled in red. Historic hearing on Medicare cuts. Millions could lose benefits. The words burned like a warning flare. This wasn't politics as usual. It was survival. The gavel struck, sharp and final, and the room stilled. The committee chair called the hearing to order. Jasmine Crockett spoke first, her voice warm but unyielding, weaving facts with faces, numbers with names. She didn't just talk about policy. She talked about people. Then came Nancy Mace. Her words were crisp, her tone cool, clipped, almost surgical. She spoke of budgets and fiscal responsibility, but there was no trace of the human cost in her voice. The tension coiled tighter, second by second, and no one in that room knew the first shot was about to be fired. Halfway through the opening statements, the room was steady until Nancy Mace leaned forward. She let out a short, dry laugh, just loud enough for the microphones to catch. Her eyes flicking over Jasmine with the kind of slow appraisal meant to belittle. One eyebrow arched, a silent, "You don't belong here" that the cameras didn't miss. She didn't wait for recognition. She didn't even glance at the chair. Then her voice cut through the air like glass shattering. "You're nothing more than a welfare queen, defending leeches who drain our system." The words hit the chamber like a gunshot. Gasps rippled from row to row. The sound of shuffling papers stopped. Even the camera operators froze for a beat. Frank Miller's jaw clenched tight. In a living room in Ohio, an elderly man muttered a curse under his breath. In Florida, a retiree leaned forward, eyes narrowing. For Jasmine Crockett, the rest of the room faded away. The voices, the tapping pens, the faint hum of the air vents. Gone. All that remained was the echo of those two words. Welfare queen. Her face stayed perfectly still, but her eyes locked onto Mace like steel catching light. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Slowly, almost without thinking, her right hand brushed the inside of her blazer, fingertips finding the folded letter. The silence stretched, taut as a wire ready to snap. Mace leaned back in her chair, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth, as if daring Jasmine to answer. But Jasmine said nothing, not yet, because what came next would turn an insult into a moment that shook the nation. The sting of Mace's words still hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Jasmine felt the heat rise in her chest. The instinct to fire back, to meet insult with fire. But she knew better. Emotion might win the moment. Evidence could win the war. She forced a slow breath, letting the noise of the chamber seep back into her awareness. Pens tapping, feet shifting, the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Each sound anchored her, kept her steady. Across the room, the cameras caught Frank Miller in the back row. His shoulders were rigid, his breathing shallow. His eyes never left Jasmine, as if he was silently asking her to be his voice. In his lap, the letter sat like a fragile relic, his knuckles white around its edges. Jasmine's gaze met his for just a second. That was enough. She pushed back her chair, the scrape of wood on marble echoing louder than it should have. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice calm but cutting clean through the tension. "I would like to respond." All eyes turned toward her. Even Mace's smirk faded a fraction. Jasmine reached into her blazer, fingers brushing against the familiar folds of paper. She drew it out slowly. The letter's edges frayed, the ink softened by years. She held it in both hands, letting the room see it before she spoke again. Then she paused. Not for effect, but for respect. The chamber seemed to lean toward her, waiting. And in that silence, Jasmine decided exactly how this battle would be fought. Jasmine unfolded the letter with deliberate care, the paper whispering as it opened. She glanced down at the first line, and her voice, low but steady, filled the chamber. Vietnam, 1968. The rain never stopped. It soaked through our boots, our packs, our bones. The jungle was so dark, you only knew your brothers were near when you felt their breath beside you. She read of monsoon nights, of bullets slicing the air, of holding a friend's hand until it went still. Each word painted the battlefield in raw, unflinching strokes. You could almost hear the chopper blades, smell the gunpowder, feel the mud under your knees. Then her tone shifted. 55 years later, I am still fighting. But now, the enemy is the price tag on my insulin. The landlord's notice on my door. The letter from the hospital saying my insurance won't cover the surgery I need. Her voice didn't crack, but her grip on the paper tightened. The chamber was silent except for her words. Far beyond those walls, veterans in VFW halls sat straighter and saluted their screens. In a small-town clinic, a nurse wiped at her eyes. In a living room in Florida, an elderly couple leaned together, their fingers intertwined. Every sentence landed heavy. A hammer against the cold, clinical language of budget cuts. This wasn't numbers on a spreadsheet. This was the price paid in flesh, in years, in dignity. Jasmine lowered the letter, her eyes sweeping the room. She wasn't just reading Frank Miller's words. She was making every person in that chamber own them. When Jasmine's voice fell silent, the stillness was almost unnatural. For a long second, no one moved. The weight of the letter hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Several members of Congress shifted in their seats, their eyes dropping to the papers in front of them as if unable to meet her gaze. One reached for a glass of water, sipping slowly, just to have something to do with his hands. Even the committee chair paused, his gavel resting loosely in his fingers. At the far end of the dais, Nancy Mace leaned back in her chair. At first, there was that same smirk. The one she'd worn since she walked into the chamber. But the cameras caught it faltering, the corner of her mouth tightening as if she'd just bitten into something bitter. Jasmine folded the letter with deliberate care, the paper creasing with a quiet finality. Then she looked straight into the nearest camera. Straight into the living rooms and VFW halls of America. If we abandon people like Frank, then America abandons itself. The words landed heavy, unblinking, leaving no room for spin. They weren't aimed at the politicians in that room. They were aimed at the people who would decide, in their hearts, what kind of country they wanted to live in. For a heartbeat, it felt like the hearing might end there. A mic drop moment etched into history. But Frank Miller wasn't done making history that day. The last word from Jasmine still hung in the air when, in the back row, a slow movement caught the room's attention. Frank Miller was standing. It wasn't quick. It wasn't easy. One hand gripped the head of his cane. The other braced against the bench as he pushed himself upright. The cane's rubber tip met the marble with a faint thock. Then another, then another. Each step sounded louder than it should have, echoing off the chamber walls. Heads began to turn. Conversation stopped. Even the camera operators swung their lenses toward him, instinctively following the sound of those measured steps. From behind, the shot caught the slope of his shoulders, the careful lift of each foot, the slight tremor in his arm as he steadied himself. Through the hush, you could hear his breathing. Slow, labored, but unwavering. Every inch of the walk carried the weight of decades. The jungles of Vietnam, the long nights in hospital wards, the battles fought in silence. Jasmine's eyes widened as she saw him coming. She stepped back from the microphone without hesitation, making room at the table as though she already knew something important was about to happen. Nancy Mace shifted in her seat, glancing toward the veteran's slow advance. There was no smirk now. Only the kind of stillness that comes when you realize the moment is no longer in your control. Frank didn't rush. He didn't need to. With every deliberate step, the atmosphere in the chamber tightened, like a drumskin pulled taut, waiting for the strike. And when he finally reached the table, the entire room was leaning forward. Frank stopped beside the table, his cane steadying him as his free hand reached for the inside of his jacket. The room held its breath. You could hear the faint creak of leather as he unfastened a small clasp. From beneath the fabric, he drew out a purple heart. Its metal caught the overhead lights. A flash of deep violet and silver that seemed to pull every gaze in the room. His fingers trembled, but his voice, when it came, was clear. "If she's a welfare queen," he said, eyes locked on Nancy Mace, "then I'm her loyal subject, and every veteran in this country is too." A murmur swelled, then broke into stunned silence. Frank turned toward Jasmine. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the ribbon over her head, letting the metal rest against her chest. The gesture was simple, but it hit like a thunderclap. A transfer of honor, of trust, of everything that metal stood for. The chamber erupted. Applause crashed against the marble walls, a wave that kept building. Some members stood without thinking, their hands coming together harder and faster. The sound was layered with something else. A deep, cinematic thrum, the kind of heartbeat you feel in your ribs. Far beyond the chamber, the moment was already breaking free. A reporter in the press gallery tapped out a tweet. "Veteran gives Purple Heart to Rep. Jasmine Crockett after Mace insult. Says I'm her loyal subject." Within minutes, loyal subject was climbing, post after post sharing the clip, veterans and civilians alike adding their own salutes. And in that instant, it wasn't just a metal changing hands. It was the weight of a nation's respect. The applause in the chamber was still echoing when the clip hit the internet. 30 seconds of video. Frank's trembling hand, the metal, those 8 words, shot across timelines like sparks in dry grass. CNN ran it on loop, their anchors calling it the most powerful moment on the Hill this year. Fox News debated whether it was authentic or political theater. Talk radio lit up with callers, veterans, teachers, factory workers, all with something to say. On TikTok, the clip was remixed with slow motion, swelling orchestral music, and hashtags stacking by the second. In VFW halls from Texas to Maine, Old men in worn uniforms stood and saluted the screen. A group of nurses in Chicago huddled around a phone, replaying the moment until the battery died. At a small-town diner in Ohio, a waitress wiped her eyes between pouring coffee refills. Veterans groups moved fast. Statements poured in. "We stand with Rep. Crockett. This is what respect looks like." Jasmine's office inbox flooded. Thousands of messages from people she'd never met, telling her their stories, thanking her for standing her ground. Meanwhile, across the hall, Nancy Mace's aides were in crisis mode. Phones rang nonstop. Draft statements were written, scrapped, rewritten. Every camera seemed to find her, and every reporter wanted the same thing. A reaction she couldn't afford to give. By nightfall, Loyal Subject had passed 2 million mentions. News outlets were running split screens. On one side, the medal. On the other, Mace's frozen expression. For Jasmine, it was a day she'd never forget. For Mace, it was a wound that wouldn't heal quickly. But in politics, a moment of glory is never safe from the storm that follows. The medal moment had barely cooled on the news cycle when the counterattack began. Conservative talk shows rolled out the headline, "Playing the Victim." Clips of Jasmine with the Purple Heart were replayed, but now overlaid with pundits accusing her of weaponizing veterans for political gain. Nancy Mace made the rounds on primetime interviews. She didn't walk back her words. She doubled down. "I said what needed to be said," she told one host. America can't afford to be held hostage by emotional theatrics. The host nodded, giving her the floor to reframe the entire scene. On social media, the tone turned venomous. Troll accounts flooded Jasmine's mentions. Threats, slurs, and images doctored to twist the moment into a joke. One viral meme replaced the medal with a welfare check. Another painted her into a propaganda poster. The harassment was relentless, day and night. Her staff filtered through thousands of messages, flagging the worst ones for security. But even in the safety of her office, Jasmine could feel the weight of it pressing in. To her supporters, the medal was a badge of honor. To her detractors, it had become a target on her back. And in the ruthless churn of politics, both sides knew one truth. Glory never lasts long before the knives come out. The applause was over. The fight was just getting started. 2 days after the storm broke, Jasmine met Frank in a quiet corner of a D.C. coffee shop. No cameras, no aides. Just two people bound by a moment that had set the country on fire. Frank looked older than he had in the chamber. The weight of years sat heavy on his shoulders, but his eyes, those were still sharp. He leaned forward over the table, his voice low but firm. "You fight for them," he said, nodding toward the window, where strangers passed in the cold. "You fight for me?" The words landed with the same gravity as the medal around her neck. This wasn't just about a hearing anymore. It was about the people whose stories never made it into the headlines. The ones quietly paying the price for every political decision. Jasmine sat back, letting the truth of it settle. The trolls could scream. The pundits could twist. But if she let this moment die, so would the hope it had sparked. By the time she left that table, the decision was made. She would take the fight beyond Capitol Hill. Swing states, Rust Belt towns, packed union halls and VFW posts. And she wouldn't just talk about the insult. She would talk about the bill, the cuts, and the faces they would hurt. She would make sure no one, not even her loudest critics, could pretend they didn't know. The medal was no longer just a symbol. It was a mission. And Jasmine Crockett was done playing defense. The stage lights were hot, the cameras everywhere. It wasn't the Capitol this time. It was a nationally televised debate, and every network had sent their top anchors. The crowd was a mix of veterans, seniors, and working families, all packed into the auditorium. Nancy Mace struck first. She leaned into her mic, voice dripping with calculated confidence. Congresswoman Crockett, you've spent weeks parading around a medal and a sob story instead of facing the real issue. We can't afford these programs. Gasps scattered through the room, a few murmurs of agreement, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She waited for Mace to finish, then leaned forward, her tone calm, but edged like a scalpel. You want the real issue? Here it is. 34,000 veterans lost their homes last year. 1 in 5 seniors skips their medication because they can't pay for it. And every one of those stories is a direct result of votes like yours. She held up a stack of testimonies. Names, faces, places. She read 3. Each one was a gut punch. A widow in Pennsylvania rationing insulin, a retired firefighter selling his tools to pay rent, a Marine sleeping in his truck. The silence in the room deepened with each story. Even the moderators stayed quiet. When Jasmine was done, she looked Mace dead in the eye. These aren't props. They're people. And they deserve better than your contempt. The crowd didn't just applaud. They stood. The sound rolled over the stage like a wave, but the real test was still ahead. Weeks had passed since the cameras captured the Purple Heart hearing, but its impact hadn't faded. It had deepened. In committee rooms and back-channel meetings, lawmakers whispered about the shift in public opinion. The budget numbers were suddenly being redrawn. Proposals that once had no chance were now on the table. 2 new bills emerged, both aimed at protecting Social Security and expanding Medicare benefits for veterans. They carried bipartisan support, something rare enough to make headlines. And every press release, every news segment, carried the same phrase. Inspired by the Purple Heart hearing, Nancy Mace felt the fallout in her own numbers. Internal polling leaked to the press showed her approval rating slipping, especially in swing districts heavy with veterans and retirees. The image of her that day, the insult, the smirk, had become campaign-ed fodder for her opponents. Meanwhile, veterans organizations went on the offensive. The American Legion, VFW, and smaller grassroots groups flooded Congress with letters and calls, demanding more funding for veteran health care and housing. At rallies, they held up enlarged photos of Frank Miller placing the medal on Jasmine Crockett's neck. A moment that had already taken on the weight of history. Jasmine didn't gloat. She stayed focused, telling anyone who'd listen that this wasn't about a political win. It was about promises made and promises kept. But she knew the hearing had done more than change policy. It had drawn a line in the sand. And for millions watching, that line was clear. The networks broke into their regular programming for a special address. Jasmine stood at a simple podium, no grand backdrop, no party banners. Just the flag behind her and the Purple Heart resting against her jacket. Her eyes were steady, her voice low but unshakable. Justice isn't charity, she began. It's a debt we owe to one another. She spoke about promises, the kind written into law and the kind written in blood on battlefields. She talked about Frank Miller, but also about the thousands of Franks across the country whose names never made the news. Her words carried no theatrics, only truth. As she spoke, the broadcast cut to a montage. Letters pouring into her office, envelopes stacked in cardboard boxes. A senior in Ohio writing, "You gave us hope." A single mother in Arizona saying, "You reminded me my voice matters." A veteran in Montana sending a photo of himself saluting the TV. Each story layered on the next, a chorus of gratitude and resolve. This wasn't just political support. It was a movement knitting itself together in real time. Jasmine ended with a quiet challenge. When we care for the most vulnerable among us, we care for the very soul of this country. And I will never stop fighting for that soul. The screen faded to black, but the echoes of her words lingered in living rooms across America, and somewhere in South Carolina, Nancy Mace watched too. knowing this battle was far from over. A week after her nationwide address, Jasmine drove out to a quiet street lined with old oak trees. Frank's house was small, worn at the edges, but the porch was swept clean and the flag out front fluttered in the evening breeze. He welcomed her in without ceremony. On the kitchen table sat a small velvet case, open and empty. Frank rested his hand on it, the way someone might rest a hand on a family Bible. "This," he said softly, "used to hold my purple heart. Now it holds something bigger." He slid the case toward her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence carried more weight than words. They stepped outside as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Frank leaned against the porch railing, Jasmine beside him, both staring out at the quiet street. The air was still, except for the distant sound of kids playing down the block. Jasmine turned, meeting the camera's lens head-on. Her voice was calm, but it carried the kind of conviction that makes people stop what they're doing and listen. "If you were in that room, whose side would you stand on?" The screen froze for half a beat, holding her gaze. Then the image faded to black, and in bold white letters, one hashtag appeared: loyal subject. The music swelled, not triumphant, but resolute. The sound of a fight far from finished. Sometime, a single moment of speaking up can go far beyond a debate. It can reach the hearts of millions and rekindle the belief that justice still lives. Protecting the vulnerable isn't an act of charity. It's a duty every citizen carries. If you were to witness injustice right before your eyes, would you turn away or be the one to step forward and stand on the side of what's right? If Frank's walk to that table and Jasmine's stand stirred something in you, don't let it fade. 820. Like, share, and subscribe to First Shock. Where courage speaks louder than insults, tap the bell. Because tomorrow, it could be your fight. And now I want to hear from you. If you were in that room, whose side would you stand on? Would you rise from your seat and take that long walk to the table? Or keep your eyes down and let the moment pass? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think. This dramatized story is inspired by real struggles and real people. All characters and dialogue are fictionalized for commentary and education. It is not intended to defame or mislead, but to inspire reflection and civic awareness. Thanks for watching.